Chapter 5. The Portrait in the West Wing. In the first few months there was no sign of a curse, no taunting sisters, no beastly visage, and no villainous servants plotting his death. The idea was laughable, really. His royal servants growing to hate him. Ludicrous. Imagine his beloved Cogsworth or Mrs. Potts wishing for his death. Utterly inconceivable. It was pure claptrap. Nothing of which the sisters spoke came true, and he saw no reason to believe it would. As a result, he did not think he needed to repent, change his ways, or take anything those insane women had to say seriously at all. Life went on and it was good as it had always been, with Gaston at his side, money in his pockets, and women to fawn over him. What more could he ask for? But as happy as he was, he couldn't completely shake the fear that perhaps Circe and her sisters were right. He noticed little changes in his appearance, small things that made him feel his mind might be betraying him and he was somehow falling for the sisters' ruse. He had to constantly, obsessively remind himself that there was no curse. There were only his fears and the sisters' lies, and he wasn't about to let either get the better of him. He was in his bedroom readying himself for a hunting trip with Gaston when the porter came in to let him know his friend had arrived. Send him up then, unless he wants to take breakfast in the observatory while I finish getting ready. The prince was in fine spirits and found himself feeling better than he had in a long time, but he couldn't for the life of him remember the porter's name. A bit concerning, but one of the advantages of being a prince that no one questions you. So if others were noticing a change in the prince, they didn't mention it. Are my things packed? Is everything ready for our stalking expedition? He asked the porter. Indeed, my liege, it's all been loaded. If there's nothing else that you require, then I shall see to the other gentlemen's things. The prince had to laugh. Gaston a gentleman? Hardly. The porter was too young to remember when Gaston and the prince had been boys. Some of the older staff would remember. Mrs. Potts would remember, to be sure. She had often recounted old stories about the boys as children, laughing at the memory of them running to the kitchen and pleading with her for sweets after their grand adventures, both of them covered in mud, tracking it throughout the castle, like little boys love to do, making a maid trail after them, a maid who muttered curses under her breath the entire time. Curses. Put them out of your mind. Remember something else. Mrs. Potts. She loved telling the story of how the boys had convinced themselves the castle grounds had been plagued by an evil dragon. On more than one occasion the boys went off adventuring all day and were gone well into the night, making everyone sick with worry over what might have befallen them, and the two of them just waltzed right in as happy and gay as could be, without a care in the world, wondering what the fuss was all about. That was how those boys had been. The prince wondered how much they'd actually changed, though Mrs. Potts reminded him at every opportunity that both he and Gaston had changed a great deal. She often said she didn't see much of the little boys she once adored in either of them. Changed. He had changed, hadn't he? And not in the way Mrs. Potts feared. In other ways. She still loved them, though. She couldn't help herself. She probably even thought of Gaston as a gentleman. She always treated him as such. She saw the best in everyone when she could, and encouraged their friendship when they were young, even though he was the gamekeeper's son. It shouldn't matter who his father is, young master. He is your friend, and has proven to be a very good one at that. He remembered feeling terrible for letting a thing like status make him reconsider a friendship with Gaston. None of that mattered, not now. Gaston had his own lands and people to work them. The prince had seen to that, and that life when they were so young, when Gaston lived with his father in the stable quarters, it all seemed so far away and long ago. Gaston's very voice interrupted his thoughts. Prince, why are you standing there daydreaming when you should be readying yourself? We have a long journey ahead of us. I was remembering when we were young, Gaston, recalling our earlier adventures. Do you remember the time you saved my life in the... Gaston's face hardened. You know I don't like to talk about that, Prince. Must you always remind me that I am not your equal? That wasn't my aim, dear friend. Nevertheless, it is the result. The prince felt scolded. Gaston seemed to be lost in his own thoughts now, musing over the large portrait of the prince hanging over the fireplace. When did you sit for this portrait? How long ago was it? 5 years? It was finished only a quarter of a year ago. You remember, it was done by that wildly eccentric painter. He called himself the Maestro, remember? He seemed to live in another world altogether, with his pretty speeches about preserving our youth and making time stand still through the magic of depiction. I do, yes. He was very, interesting. Interesting. You wanted to toss him out the nearest window, if I recall. The two laughed, but Gaston seemed to be preoccupied with thoughts other than those about strange painters and their proclamation of preserving a moment in time. I suppose there is something to his insane ramblings, though. I do seem much changed since this painting. Look, around the eyes in the painting. There is no sign of lines, but if you see here, it does look as though I've aged more than 5 years. You sound like a woman, Prince, worrying about lines around the eyes. Next, you'll be wondering what color petticoat looks best with a blue dress. Shall I inquire with your fairy godmother? The prince laughed, but it wasn't genuine. Gaston continued, "We have better things to do than waste the day clucking away like a couple of hens. Meet me in the observatory for breakfast when you're finished getting ready. Yes, feel free to start without me. I'm sure Mrs. Potts is in a tizzy that is taking us so long to get down there." The portrait was still bothering him. How had his eyes become so lined in just a few months? Was it possible they had looked like this at the time and the painter wished to compliment him by making him seem younger? No, the maestro was very specific about preserving that moment in time, making it as pure and realistic as possible, freezing a moment that could never be diminished or altered, preserving it for the generations so they might evoke something of his memory once he was long gone. So the man had said, almost word for word. It seemed contrary to his annoying speeches and proclamations for him to have painted the prince any differently than he had appeared at the time. So Gaston was right. Had he aged 5 years in just over 3 months? Or was Gaston simply being mean spirited because he'd reminded him of when they were young? Could it be? No. But what if? What if Circe's curse was real? Then he remembered the sister's mirror. He had tucked it away the night the fiendish harpies gave it to him, and hadn't given it a second thought. Their words started to ring in his ears, and he couldn't take his mind off the hellish thing. "It will show you as the beast you are bound to become." He walked over to the mantel. Sitting on top was a voluminous tortoise-shell cat with narrow yellow eyes lined in black. She looked down at him, scrutinizing him as he looked for the button that opened the secret compartment within the fireplace mantel. The fireless pit was flanked by two griffins with ruby red eyes that sparkled in the morning light. He pressed one of the eyes inward, and it recessed into the griffin's skull. Each griffin had a crest on its chest. The crest on the griffin to the right popped out, revealing the compartment containing the mirror. The prince just stood there, looking at it. The mirror had landed face down when he tossed it in. He stared at its backside. It was seemingly harmless, a simple silver hand mirror, almost entirely black now from tarnish. He reached in, grabbing the mirror by its handle. It was cold in his hand, and he fancied he could feel the evil of the sisters penetrating him by his simply touching it. Fancy. He held it to his chest for a moment, not wanting to look at himself, wondering if this was folly. He was letting the sisters get to him. He had promised himself he wouldn't surrender to fears and superstitions, yet he found himself wanting to look into the mirror, and he was worried about what he might see. Enough of this foolishness. He gathered his courage, lifted the mirror, and looked into it unflinchingly, determined to face his fears. At first glance, he didn't seem much changed. His heart felt lighter, and he indeed felt foolish for letting the sister's threats invade his thoughts. "Look closer, Prince." He dropped the mirror and was afraid he had broken it, though it might have been a blessing if he had. He was sure it was Lucinda's voice he'd heard taunting him from the black ether, or wherever she deigned to dwell. It was hell itself for all he knew. Picking up the mirror with a shaking hand, he took a second look. This time he did see deep lines around his eyes. Gaston was right. He looked a good 5 years older after just a few months. The lines made his face look cruel, heartless, all the things Circe said he was. Impossible. His heart started to pound like thunder. It was pounding so violently that he felt as if it would burst within his chest. Then came the laughter. It surrounded him, cacophonous. The wicked cackling seemed to come from lands unseen. Their voices, their vindictive words entrapped him, causing his anxieties to overwhelm him. His vision became narrowed, and soon all he saw were the cat's yellow eyes staring at him from the mantel. Then everything closed in on him, and his world became black, nothingness. He was alone in the darkness, with only the sisters' laughter and his own dread to keep him company. He woke what seemed like some days later, feeling as if he'd been beaten by a gang of blackguards. His entire body ached, and he could barely move. The sisters had ensured his misery and compounded it with their laughter and taunting, leaving him ill and suffering. "You're awake, sir," said Cogsworth from the corner chair where he had been sitting. "We were very worried about you, sir. What happened?" The prince's head was still slightly befogged, and he couldn't quite get his bearings. "Well, it seems, sir, you were very ill, suffering from a severe fever. When you hadn't come down to breakfast, I came up to find you lying on the floor. Where's the mirror?" "The mirror, sir?" "Oh, yes. I put it on your dressing stand." The prince's panic subsided. Was it all a dream, then? All fancy brought on by worry or illness? "I don't know what you mean, sir, but you were rather ill. We're all very much relieved to hear you are out of the woods, as they say." Cogsworth was putting on a brave face, as he always did, but the prince could tell he had been worried. He looked tired, worn, and uncustomarily rumpled. He was usually fastidious. It was a credit to his loyalty that it seemed he had been at the prince's side during his entire illness. "Thank you, Cogsworth. You're a good man." "Thank you, sir. It was nothing." Before Cogsworth could be embarrassed any further, the porter poked in his head sheepishly to say, "Excuse me, sir. It's just that Mrs. Potts wants Cogsworth down in the kitchens." "Here now, I won't have Mrs. Potts telling me where I am needed," grumbled Cogsworth. "No, she's right. You look like you could use a good cup of tea," said the prince. "I'm fine. Go to the kitchens before she waddles her way up here, getting angrier with each flight of stairs she has to take to reach us." Cogsworth laughed at the thought of it. "Perhaps you're right, sir." He left the room, taking the porter along with him. The prince felt incredibly foolish for thinking he had actually been cursed. As he looked out the window, the trees were violently swaying, dancing to a maniac's song only they were privy to. He longed to be out of doors, tracking elk and talking with his friend about anything other than the sisters, Circe, or curses. And, as if by magic, there was a knock at the door. It was Gaston. "My friend, I heard you were awake. That Cogsworth wouldn't let anyone in your room except Dr. Hillsworth, who just came downstairs to let us know you were finally on your way to health." "Yes, Gaston, I'm feeling much better, thank you." Looking at Gaston, the prince noticed he hadn't shaven in more than a few days, and the prince wondered how long he had been ill. "Have you been here all along, good friend?" "I have. Cogsworth gave me a room in the east wing, but I spent most of my time down in the kitchens with Mrs. Potts and the others." Gaston seemed almost like the young boy the prince had befriended so many years earlier, his face tensed with worry over his friend's illness, and spending his time in the kitchen like the other servants' children. "Stay as long as you like. This was once your home, friend, and I want you to always feel it as such." Gaston looked touched by the sentiment, but didn't say so. "I'm going to make myself presentable before heading home. I'm sure things have gone to the winds without me there for so many days." "Surely Le Fou has it handled." The prince tried not to look disappointed his friend was making plans to leave. "Doubtful. He's a fool at best. Don't fret, my friend. I'm sure Cogsworth will be up shortly to keep you company, and help you to make plans for the party we're throwing the moment you're well enough." "Party?" the prince asked. Gaston gave one of his magic smiles, the kind that always ensured he would get his way. "Yes, a party, my friend, one that will be remembered throughout the ages." Chapter 6. Gaston's Grand Idea. Gaston's plan went directly into action only a few short weeks after the prince's recovery. The entire staff was behind it and thought it was exactly the thing he needed. "This is like a dream," was heard throughout the castle by Mrs. Potts as she amended menus and made suggestions for little cakes to be served in the great hall. Cogsworth had an extra bounce in his step, but was too austere to let it be known he was pleased to have a bustling house again to take control of like a general at war. And that was how he directed things, ordering the staff hither and thither to ready the castle for the grand event. The prince, however, had needed some persuading before he agreed to such a party. Gaston argued that after the mishap with Circe and his long illness, the prince deserved a thrilling diversion. What better way to find the most enchanting woman in the kingdom than to invite every fair and available maiden so that you may have your pick, and all under the guise of a fanciful ball? The prince didn't share Gaston's enthusiasm. "I hate such events, Gaston. I see no need to stuff my house with frilly ladies prancing around like decorated birds." Gaston laughed. "If we invite every fair maiden in the kingdom, I dare say every girl will attend." The prince protested. That is my point entirely, my friend. No girl would pass up her opportunity to shine in the prince's eyes. But that is what I fear. Surely there will be far more ghastly looking girls than beautiful. How should I stand it? Gaston put his hand on his friend's shoulder and replied, No doubt you will have to wade through some ugly ducklings before you find your princess. But won't it be worth it? What of your friend who had such a ball? Wasn't it a great success after the matter of the glass slipper was sorted? The prince laughed. Indeed, but you won't catch me marrying a housemaid like my dear friend, no matter how beautiful she is, not after the disaster with the pig keeper. The talk went on like that for many days, until the prince decided he would have the ball after all. And why not? Why shouldn't he demand the attendance of every available maiden in the kingdom? He and Gaston would make a game of it, and if he did happen to find the young woman of his dreams, then all the better. So it was decided. He didn't have to think any more about it until the night of the event. In the meantime, he did his best to dodge his servants, running about like wild geese, being chased by hounds. He forgave their franticness and even grew to laugh when he heard Mrs. Potts patting her way down the hall to ask him this or that about what he'd like served. Meanwhile, the maids were polishing silver in the dining room, the grooms were readying the stables for the guests' horses, and the parlor maids were perched precariously on tall ladders, dusting the chandeliers and replacing the old candles with new. The house was a bustle, and he wanted nothing more than to get out of doors and do some hunting. But Gaston was out traversing his lands, dealing with one thing or another, and couldn't be bothered with trivial sport. The prince chimed the bell for Cogsworth. Yes, sir, you rang? Asked Cogsworth, knowing full well he had. The prince always detested all this ceremony, but he let Cogsworth have his way. He remembered what his father, rest his soul, had said to him many years ago. He said everyone in the house, upstairs and down, had their place and their roles to play. To deny a man like Cogsworth his duty and remove him from his place was like taking away his sense of self and dignity. Cogsworth had treated him well for many years. He couldn't shatter the man's self-worth by treating him like family, even though that was how he had grown to think of him. It was an unspoken sentiment between them. The prince believed Cogsworth thought the same of him, but was too austere to say so. Yes, Cogsworth, I would like you to arrange for the maestro as soon as manageable. I mean to have another portrait. Cogsworth rarely let his expression betray him. Yes, sir, I shall send for him. What is it, Cogsworth? Don't you approve? It seemed he thought about it for a moment before answering. It isn't my place to say so, sir, but if it was, I would mention how interesting the household becomes when he visits. The prince had to laugh. He had thought Cogsworth was going to comment on how recently he had a portrait done. Indeed, he is a bit of a character, isn't he? He treats the other staff well, though, doesn't he? You don't have a complaint on that account, do you? Oh, no, sir, it isn't that. A gentleman such as the maestro isn't the least bit challenging in that regard. No, sir, he's just an eccentric fellow. Wouldn't you agree? Yes, he is, and very keen on himself and the impact his art makes on the world, I would say. Enough of that. I am sure you are very busy with all the details for tomorrow's event. I trust everything is in hand. Cogsworth looked positively proud, almost beaming. Oh, yes, everything is running like clockwork, sir. It's going to be a perfect evening. And Gaston, have you any word from him? He all but insisted I had this party and then took off to places unknown, leaving me here to dawdle my time away. Cogsworth smirked. Yes, sir. He sent word this morning, ensuring he would be back tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I've asked the gamekeeper to ready for a day of stalking. I thought with the house in such a state, you would be eager to get out of doors. Brilliant idea, Cogsworth. Thank you. On the following evening, the castle was aglow with gold flickering light, which was dancing in the hedge maze, making the animal topiary seem to come to life. Everyone would be arriving within the hour, but the prince was finding a moment of quiet in one of his favorite places on the castle grounds. The tranquillity was shattered by Gaston's booming voice calling for him from the arched entryway covered in tiny pink blossoming roses. Are you in this damnable maze again, Prince? The prince didn't answer his friend. He just sat there, wondering what the night would bring. He had also been thinking of Circe, and wondering if it was possible to ever find another girl who loved him as much as she had. There had been times he thought Circe was a dream and her sister some sort of nightmare he had conjured in his own fevered imagination. He lost so much time already, it didn't seem reasonable to waste much more with thoughts of Circe, her harpy sisters, or curses. Your guests will be arriving any moment, Gaston shouted. And though he wouldn't admit it, I think Cogsworth will blow a gasket if you're not there to greet them as they enter the great hall. The prince sighed. I'll be right there. Gaston turned the corner, seeing his friend sitting near a towering topiary of a winged lion. What's the matter? I thought this would liven your spirits. Every girl in 3 kingdoms is said to attend. It's going to be magnificent. The prince stood, straightening his velvet frock coat, and said, Yes, it will be. Let's not keep the girls waiting. The girls filed in by the hundreds, so many of them. He didn't know there would be so many in all the world. All of them were decked out for the occasion. There were stunning brunettes with dark hunting eyes, pale and lovely blondes with perfect ringlets, striking redheads with jade-colored eyes, and everything in between. They all paraded past him, some hiding behind their fans and giggling, while others tried not to look the least bit interested in whether he glanced in their direction. Some seemed too nervous to keep from trembling, sometimes so violently they lost composure altogether and spilled their drinks. There was one girl with auburn hair he didn't manage to see properly. She seemed always to have her back turned. She must have been very beautiful, because he caught the dirty glances she received from the other ladies as they passed her, and quite unlike the others, she didn't travel in a swarm of girls. She stood off, apart from most everyone, seeming not the least bit interested in the idle chatter of the fairer sex. Gaston, who is that girl? The one in the blue dress I saw you talking with earlier? What's her name? Gaston pretended he didn't recall, annoying the prince. You know very well to whom I'm referring, man. Bring her over here and introduce me. You wouldn't be interested in her, trust me. The prince raised an eyebrow. Wouldn't I? And why is that, my good friend? Gaston lowered his voice so those nearby wouldn't hear. She's the daughter of Cuckoo. Oh, she's lovely, yes, but her father is the laughing stock of the village. He's harmless enough, but fancies himself a great inventor. He's always building contraptions that clank, rattle, and explode. She isn't the sort you'd like to get mixed up with, good friend. Perhaps you're right, but nevertheless, I would like to meet her. I dare say you would find her very tedious with her endless talk of literature, fairy tales, and poetry. You seem to know quite a bit about her, Gaston, the prince said with a comical knowing nod. I fear I do. In the few moments we spoke just now, she prattled on of nothing else. No, dear friend, we need to find you a proper lady, a princess, someone like the Princess Morningstar over there. Now, she is a delight. No talk of books from her. I bet she's never read even a single book, or had a thought of her own. The prince thought that was a very good quality in a woman. He could do enough thinking for both himself and his future wife. Yes, bring over the Princess Morningstar. I'd very much like to meet her. Princess Tulip Morningstar had long golden locks, with milk and honey complexion, and light sky blue eyes. She looked like a doll draped in diamonds and pink silks. She was remarkably beautiful, radiant, in fact. Everything about her sparkled, with one exception, her personality. But that didn't bother the prince. He had enough personality for both of them. It wouldn't do to have a wife who took attention away from him. Morning Star had a charming little habit of giggling when she didn't have nothing to contribute on a subject, which was most of the time. This made him feel like the best of tutors. Honestly, he could talk about anything and her attentions were never diverted from him. She just giggled. He had already decided he was going to marry her, and judging by the sulky looks on the faces of the rest of the ladies in attendance, it must have been quite clear. Gaston looked positively pleased with himself that he had helped arrange a perfect match for his friend, and for his part he saw to it that the other ladies didn't go without a dance partner for very long. It seemed to the prince that Gaston must have danced with every girl there that evening, all except the inventor's daughter, who by all accounts didn't seem too pleased to be there to begin with, though he couldn't tell by the look on her face, because he hadn't, in fact, had a single clear glance at her the entire evening. None of that mattered, though. He had his darling Princess Tulip to look after now. Chapter 7. The Princess and the Portrait. The prince was more pleased than ever the maestro was coming to do his portrait now that he'd made Princess Tulip Morningstar his fiancée. It would be an engagement portrait with the two most attractive members of royalty anyone had beheld. The princess went back to her father's kingdom after the ball and awaited the various ceremonies, parties, and other trappings that would take place during their engagement, all leading up to, of course, the most majestic of weddings. She would, by custom, live with her family, visiting the prince frequently with her nanny as chaperone, and sometimes also bringing her mother along as it suited her or the occasion presented itself. This visit she would come with her nanny. Everyone was excited that the prince had commissioned the maestro to paint the portrait. He was the most celebrated painter in many kingdoms and was in great demand. Not since the renowned master maker of mirrors had there been another artist who caused such a stir in the royal circles. Though his art could be brutally accurate, most gentry didn't seem to let that color their opinion of the man. Princess Tulip showed up on a rainy afternoon, quite soggy. Though her hair was flat and her clothes were sticking to her, she somehow managed to look pretty, and quite worth rescuing from the elements. The prince kissed her sweetly on the cheek and greeted her happily when she stepped out of the carriage. Tulip, my love, how was your journey? A grumble came from inside the carriage, and out popped what must have been his dearest Nanny. It was intolerable, as you can see. The carriage leaked, and I would be surprised if my darling girl doesn't come down with the nastiest of colds. I must get her into a hot bath at once." The prince blinked a couple of times and smiled at the woman. She was impossibly old and lined like a little apple doll that had been moldering away on a window sill. Her hair and skin were powdery white, and though much aged, her eyes were rather sparkling with life. This woman was a little firecracker. "I am so pleased to meet you at last, Nanny," he said as she wrinkled her nose at him as if there were a foul smell about the air. "Yes, yes, very pleased to meet you, Prince, I'm sure. But won't you please show us to our rooms so I can get this girl into a hot bath?" Cogsworth took things into order. "If you would follow me, Princess, I will happily show you to your quarters so you may freshen yourself after your long journey." And with that, he took the ladies up the stairs and out of sight. Well, the prince thought, this visit will be interesting with Nanny grumbling about. Perhaps he could get Mrs. Potts to divert her in the kitchens so he could have some time alone with his princess. He couldn't imagine what the week would be like with her around. His dread was squashed with the announcement of his other guest, the maestro. He came promenading in with the dandiest of outfits, all velvet and lace in various shades of lilacs and blackberry. He had large sad eyes set into a slightly swollen face, but seemed all the more handsome for it. The maestro looked as if he had a saucy story to share, and the prince wondered if it would be unwise to seat Nanny and the maestro at the same table that evening for dinner. His head spun at the thought of Nanny listening to the painter's outlandish stories. What he needed was Cogsworth. He would sort it all out. And sort it out he did. Nanny dined with Mrs. Potts, Cogsworth, and the other staff downstairs at Mrs. Potts' invitation. It wasn't custom by any means for a guest to eat with the downstairs staff, but Mrs. Potts had a way with people, and by the end of the conversation the two were swapping stories about the prince and princess when they were young, determining which of them had been more insolent. Meanwhile, dinner upstairs was delightfully charming. The servants had decorated the dining room splendidly. Rather than a large floral centerpiece, there were a number of smaller arrangements artfully placed on the table, evoking the feel of a garden infused with candlelight. There were many crystal bowls with floating flowers and candles, and the particular cut of crystal made an interesting use of the light, causing a fanciful effect of reflection on the walls and diners. It was quite beautiful, but not as beautiful as his darling love, the prince thought. The maestro broke the silence. To love in all its tantalizing and vexing forms. Tulip laughed behind her fan while the maestro stood theatrically erect with his glass raised high in the air, waiting, it seemed, for someone to respond to his toast. The prince feared the maestro might stay there forever, frozen in time, like one of his paintings, if he didn't say something quickly. "Yes, to love," he said, and quickly added, "and to you, maestro." Princess Tulip giggled again, warming the prince's heart even more. He loved how sweet and demure she was, so content to sit idly and always looking ravishing while doing so. He really couldn't have chosen a better maiden to be his bride. "I couldn't be more pleased to have you, maestro. I know you will capture the moment perfectly. We will look back on our engagement not only with fond memories, but with How was it you put it? Oh, yes, our senses will instantly be assaulted with a profound and visceral recollection of that exact moment in time. The maestro looked pleased. I'm honored you remembered my words so vividly. He then turned his attentions to the young lady, hoping to bring about something of her personality. You must be brimming with utter excitement, princess. Are you not? The princess's eyes widened with wonder. She hardly knew what to say. Oh, yes, I am. I am very much looking forward to the wedding. Of course you are. But I was of course speaking of our painting. I will want to see an assortment of outfits from each of you for my approval, and we will need to discuss the topic of location. The rose garden seems like an enchanting setting, I would think. Yes, the rose garden it shall be, I have decided, and there is no changing my mind, he continued. It seems every portrait that is painted with any real feeling is a portrait of the artist and not of the sitter. I dare say you will both be magnificent. Tulip blinked more than a few times, trying to understand his meaning. Will you be in the portrait with us, Maestro? She asked. Both gentlemen laughed. Princess Tulip Morningstar didn't know if they were laughing at what she said because it was clever or dull-witted, but she decided to act as though it had been the cleverest thing she could possibly have said, and hoped the topic would change to something she needn't partake in. The maestro, seeing the dread in her face, added, Don't fret, dear Tulip. I am so clever that sometimes I don't understand a single word of what I am saying. To this the princess could reply only by saying, Oh, and then giggling some more, which seemed to please everyone, because they joined in her laughter. The next morning the magnificent trio was found in the rose garden as the maestro sketched, and the lovers did their best to hold their poses without giving the master painter cause to become cross with them. Prince, please! This is supposed to be the happiest moment of your life, and your face looks like you've been eating something sour. Why do you look so displeased? What could you possibly be thinking of that causes one's face to contort so? The prince had in fact been thinking about the last time he was in the rose garden, the night he parted with Circe. The events had become blurred in his mind, and he was trying hard to make sense of it all. Surely Circe had brought along her wicked sisters, and they had proclaimed he was cursed for his misdeeds. He was certain he hadn't imagined it, but the curse itself, that was balderdash, wasn't it? Sometimes he couldn't help fearing it might be true. The prince was brought out of his thoughts by Cogsworth's voice. Lunch is served. The maestro slammed down his drawing coals, cracking them into tiny, powdery bits. Very well. I think I prefer to lunch in my room, alone, he huffed, and he stormed away, not uttering a single word of salutation to either of the happy couple. Rather than giggling, as we well know was Tulip's way, she wilted into a heap of tears at being scolded. The prince, it seemed, had his hands entirely full with the fitful maestro, his weeping Tulip, and her sour nanny. How would the rest of the week go?